The city bus rumbled down the street, its tires splashing through small puddles left from last night's rain. Inside, people sat quietly, lost in their own thoughts. Some looked out the window, others scrolled through their phones. The air smelled like coffee and wet pavement, a typical morning in the city. 16-year-old Emma sat near the middle of the bus, clutching the straps of her backpack tightly. Her head was down, her long brown hair falling over her face. She wished she could disappear. Next to her sat Greg, her father, his large hands gripping the seat in front of him. His face was tight with anger. "I can't believe you failed that test," Greg said loudly. His deep voice carried through the bus, making heads turn. "You never try hard enough. Emma, you're always making excuses." Emma swallowed hard. Her stomach felt like a knot. She had studied for the test, but math was difficult for her. She wanted to explain, but she knew it wouldn't matter. Greg never listened. "You think life is easy," Greg continued. "You'll never get anywhere with that attitude. You're lazy, just like your mother." Emma winced at his words. A lump formed in her throat, but she forced herself not to cry. Not here. Not in front of all these strangers. Some passengers glanced in their direction, uncomfortable. A young woman wearing headphones turned her music up. A man in a suit frowned but said nothing. An elderly lady shook her head slightly, then looked away. No one wanted to get involved. Greg wasn't done. "You embarrass me," he said, his voice growing louder. "How do you expect to succeed if you can't even pass a simple test? You think the world will feel sorry for you. No one cares, Emma. No one." Emma bit her lip. She stared down at her hands, feeling small and helpless. Maybe he was right. Maybe she really was a failure. But someone cared. At the back of the bus, a man named Jake watched the scene unfold. He sat with his arms crossed, his sharp eyes focused on Greg. He looked like an ordinary guy. Jeans, a simple t-shirt, short cropped hair. But there was something about him, a quiet strength. Jake was a former Navy SEAL. He had seen war. He had faced danger. He had stood beside men who would give their lives for each other. He knew what real strength was, and it wasn't what he was seeing now. Greg was big, loud, and full of anger. But in Jake's eyes, he wasn't strong. He was just a bully. As the bus moved forward, bouncing over small bumps in the road, Greg's words continued to sting the air. Jake felt his patience wearing thin. His hands clenched into fists. He had seen people break others down before. He had seen the damage it caused. Jake took a slow breath. He had two choices. He could stay silent like everyone else, or he could stand up. He knew what he had to do. Greg's voice filled the bus, harsh and loud. "You never try hard enough. Emma, you'll never amount to anything. You're not good enough." His words were sharp, like stones thrown at Emma's heart. She could feel every word as if it were a heavy weight on her chest. Her face turned red, but she kept her head down, trying to disappear into the seat. Around them, the passengers sat still, most of them pretending not to notice. A young man near the front of the bus stared out the window, his face expressionless. A lady in a floral dress nervously adjusted her purse, trying to ignore the scene. The only sound other than the bus's engine was Greg's voice, cutting through the air like a knife. Emma's eyes started to water, but she quickly blinked the tears away. She had been here before, listening to her father's cruel words. It wasn't the first time he humiliated her in public, but this time felt different. Maybe it was because more people were watching. Maybe it was because she was getting older, and she could feel the weight of his words more now than ever. "Everyone else in this family works hard, except for you," Greg continued, his voice rising even louder. "You always have an excuse for why things don't work out. You think the world owes you something, but no one cares. You're just lazy." Emma wanted to shout back, to explain how hard she worked on her studies, to tell him that sometimes things just didn't go the way she wanted. But she knew it wouldn't matter. Greg never listened. He had his own idea of how things should be, and nothing could change that. A few people glanced nervously at each other. Some passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, trying to ignore the uncomfortable situation. But there was one person who wasn't looking away. Jake, the man sitting at the back of the bus, watched Greg's every word. His muscles tightened with each insult that Greg threw at Emma. He had seen cruelty before. He had seen real battles and real struggles. But this wasn't a fight between two strong men. This was something else. This was a grown man using his words to hurt his daughter. Jake's jaw tightened. He had trained for years in the Navy SEALs, learning how to stay calm under pressure, how to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. He had seen the power of words and how they could break people down. He knew that when someone used words to crush another person, it wasn't just a small thing. It left marks, deep marks. But here, on this bus, no one was saying anything. No one was stopping Greg. They were all just watching, too scared or too unsure to speak up. And that made Jake angry. He leaned forward in his seat, his eyes locked on Greg. It was time to step in. Greg's voice didn't stop. You think life is easy. You think people are going to feel sorry for you. You'll never get anywhere with that attitude, Emma. I don't know why I even try to help you. Emma's shoulders hunched even lower, as if she could somehow make herself smaller, as if the world might forget her if she just vanished. Her heart pounded in her chest. The sound of Greg's voice was all she could hear now. She couldn't take it anymore. Jake stood up. His boots thudded against the bus floor as he moved toward the front. The noise of the bus faded into the background as he stepped closer to Greg. His body was calm, but his eyes were focused, and his posture was confident. Greg was still ranting, not noticing Jake at first. But the moment Jake's shadow fell over him, Greg stopped speaking. He turned his head slowly and saw the tall man standing just inches away. Jake's eyes met Greg's, calm but firm. "That's enough," he said. His voice was steady, but it carried authority. For the first time on the bus, there was a sense of silence. The passengers felt it, too. The air shifted. Everyone seemed to hold their breath. Greg sneered. "Who do you think you are, telling me how to speak to my daughter?" But Jake wasn't backing down. Real strength isn't about tearing someone down. It's about building them up. You're not teaching her anything but how to feel worthless. The words hit like a punch. Emma's heart skipped a beat. She lifted her head just enough to see what was happening. Greg looked at Jake for a moment, stunned. The bus was quiet, everyone waiting to see what would happen next. The bus fell into a heavy silence. It was as if everyone held their breath, waiting for what would happen next. Greg stared at Jake, clearly confused and a little shaken. This stranger, this big man standing in front of him, had just told him that his words were wrong. No one ever spoke to Greg like that. He was used to being the one in control, the one whose voice was loud and whose words people listened to. But now, this man was challenging him. Jake stood still, his posture calm but strong. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make any sudden movements. He just stared at Greg, his eyes unwavering. His expression was serious, but there was no anger in it, just a quiet confidence that was impossible to ignore. It was the kind of strength that came from experience, from having been through tough situations and learned how to stay grounded. The bus was so quiet now that even the hum of the engine seemed far away. Greg blinked, unsure of how to respond. He wasn't used to being confronted, especially not in front of so many strangers. He was the one who had always been in control. He was the one who made the rules. And yet, here he was, standing speechless in front of a man who wasn't afraid of him. Emma, sitting in her seat, felt a strange mix of relief and surprise. She had never seen anyone stand up to her father like this before. For the first time in what felt like forever, she wasn't the one getting yelled at. She wasn't the one who was the target of Greg's harsh words. She was just watching. She lifted her head a little, just enough to see Jake. Her eyes were wide, her breath caught in her throat. Was this really happening? Was this man really standing up to her father? And if so, why? She had been called lazy, stupid, and a failure for as long as she could remember. Her father had always been harsh with her, and it hurt every time. But she had never had anyone defend her, never had anyone stand up and say that what was happening was wrong. The thought of someone standing up for her felt like a small spark of hope, a light in the darkness. Greg took a deep breath, trying to regain his composure. His face was reddening, and his fists were clenched at his sides. "Who the heck do you think you are?" He spat, trying to sound tough. But the words didn't come out as strongly as he had hoped. There was something about Jake's calm, steady presence that made Greg feel unsure of himself. Jake didn't flinch. He remained focused, his eyes locked on Greg's. "I'm someone who knows that a real man doesn't hurt others with his words. A real man protects those who are weak, not crush them." Greg's expression twisted with anger, but he couldn't find the words to argue. The bus was still silent, except for the soft hum of the engine and the occasional murmur from a passenger. Emma could feel the weight of the moment, a strange tension hanging in the air. A few passengers shifted in their seats, their eyes flicking between Greg and Jake. Some seemed to be watching with curiosity, while others just seemed relieved that someone was finally standing up to Greg. No one had said a word up until now, but they were all feeling the same thing. This wasn't right, and someone needed to say something. The old woman who had been sitting quietly near the front of the bus finally spoke, her voice soft but firm. "He's right, you know," she said, her eyes flicking to Greg. "You're not teaching her anything but how to hate herself. That's not what a father is supposed to do." Greg's face turned even redder. He opened his mouth to say something, but the words didn't come out. It was as if his usual angry comebacks had lost their power. The moment had changed. Emma's heart skipped a beat. The voice of this stranger, the old woman, had made her feel something she hadn't felt in a long time. The support of others. For the first time, she wasn't alone in this. For the first time, someone was speaking up for her. Jake turned slightly, nodding toward the woman. "Thank you," he said, his voice soft but full of appreciation. He wasn't looking for applause or praise, but just the quiet acknowledgement that what he was doing was right. Greg was breathing heavily now, his face dark with frustration. He glanced around, but no one was backing him up. Everyone was silent, their eyes on him, waiting for him to make the next move. But he couldn't find the words. It was clear that the balance of power had shifted. Greg wasn't the strong, intimidating figure he had once been. Now he was just a man who had been exposed for what he really was, a bully. And no one was afraid of him anymore. Emma's heart raced, but a small smile crept onto her face. Maybe things could change. Maybe this wasn't the end. Maybe, just maybe, it was the beginning of something better. The silence in the bus felt almost deafening, broken only by the low hum of the engine. Greg stood there, eyes wide with confusion and anger. He opened his mouth, trying to come up with something to say, but the words wouldn't come. For the first time, he was at a loss. His usual harsh, controlling tone had no power here. Jake, still standing tall in front of Greg, didn't flinch. He wasn't looking for a fight. He wasn't trying to embarrass Greg, but he wasn't going to back down either. His voice was calm but filled with authority. "You're hurting her," he said simply. Greg's face twisted into a snarl, but Jake didn't give him a chance to respond. Real strength isn't in tearing someone down. It's in lifting them up, helping them grow. Jake continued, his voice steady and unwavering. Emma, sitting in her seat, watched the scene unfold with wide eyes. She could hardly believe what was happening. All her life, she had been on the receiving end of Greg's harsh words, never once imagining that anyone would stand up to him like this. She felt a sense of warmth rising in her chest. Was it possible that things could change? Jake paused for a moment, letting his words sink in. "You're supposed to be her father," he said quietly, "but all you've taught her is that she's not good enough. That's not what a father does. A father encourages, builds up, protects. And you've done none of that. Greg looked at Jake, his fists still clenched, but his shoulders were slumped now. There was no fight in him anymore. Emma could see it. He wasn't the powerful man he pretended to be. He was just a man who had used his power for too long, and now it was slipping away. Jake didn't raise his voice or make any threats. He didn't need to. His presence, his words, and his calm confidence spoke louder than anything else. It was clear to everyone on the bus that Jake was right. Greg wasn't strong. He was weak. Weak because he didn't know how to build his daughter up. Weak because he only knew how to bring her down. For a moment, everything was still. Emma couldn't remember the last time she had felt so calm. She had spent so many years living in fear of her father's anger, always wondering if she would ever be good enough. But now, here was this stranger, standing up for her. For the first time in her life, someone was telling her she wasn't the problem. Someone was telling her she deserved better. Jake's gaze never wavered from Greg. "You have a choice," Jake said, his voice low but firm. "You can keep going down this path, tearing her apart, making her believe she's worthless. Or you can change. You can choose to be the father she needs. But that's your decision, not hers." Greg swallowed hard, his jaw tightening. For a moment, Emma thought he might say something, but he just stood there, frozen. He couldn't argue. He couldn't fight back. His usual tactics of shouting and controlling had no effect now. Finally, Greg exhaled sharply, his shoulders dropping as if all the tension had left his body. He took a step back, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. He didn't say anything, but the message was clear. He had nothing more to say. He couldn't win this one. Emma's heart skipped a beat as she looked at her father. For the first time, she felt a sense of power she had never known before. It wasn't because she had done anything. It was because someone had finally stepped in. Someone had told her she didn't deserve to be treated like this. As the bus continued down the road, the tension slowly began to fade. The passengers who had been watching silently now looked away, uncomfortable with the confrontation. But for Emma, the silence felt different now. It felt like a weight lifting off her shoulders. Jake glanced down at Emma, his eyes softening just a bit. "Don't let anyone make you feel small," he said quietly, his voice kind but firm. "You're stronger than you think." Emma nodded, unable to speak, her throat tight with emotion. She wanted to say thank you, but the words got caught in her chest. Instead, she just gave him a small, grateful smile. It wasn't much, but it was enough to let him know how much his words had meant to her. As the bus came to her stop, Emma stood up, still feeling a strange mix of relief and gratitude. She glanced at her father, who was still standing near the front, his back turned to her. She didn't know what would happen when they got home, but for the first time, she felt a little braver. Maybe, just maybe, things were starting to change. The bus ride was long, but Emma felt as if the world had slowed down. The usual hum of the engine was there, but the tension that had filled the air before was gone. Jake was still standing near the front, watching quietly, as if he was ready to step in if needed. Greg sat down on the seat, his face flushed with anger, his fists still clenched. But he didn't say a word. The silence between him and Emma was heavy, and she could feel it weighing on her chest. The ride felt like an eternity, but Emma wasn't in a hurry to get off the bus. She felt safe, more than she ever had before. Even though her father was still there, his usual power had faded. She could still feel his presence, but it didn't seem as scary now. The harsh words he had thrown at her seemed distant, like they came from someone else. Jake's words had given her a new strength. She wasn't worthless. She wasn't lazy. For the first time, she felt like she mattered. As the bus slowly approached her stop, Emma's heart beat a little faster. She wasn't sure what would happen once she stepped off the bus, but she knew something had changed. The conversation with her father wasn't over, but she wasn't afraid anymore. Maybe she never would be again. The bus doors opened with a loud hiss, and Emma grabbed the strap of her backpack, ready to leave. She stood up and looked at her father one last time before stepping toward the exit. She felt a lump in her throat, but she didn't cry. Not anymore. Not when she had just learned that she didn't have to accept the way he treated her. Greg didn't say anything as she stepped off the bus, his gaze still focused on the floor. Emma walked out into the cold morning air, feeling the chill on her skin, but also feeling free. For the first time, she was stepping away from the control, from the constant feeling of being trapped. She was going to be okay. Jake watched her leave, his expression softening just slightly. He had done what he could. He didn't expect any thanks or gratitude, but he knew he had made a difference. Sometimes, standing up for what's right wasn't about changing everything in one moment. It was about giving someone the chance to change for themselves. He hoped Emma would find the courage to speak up more often, to stand up for herself, and to know that she wasn't alone in the world. As the bus doors closed behind Emma, she took a deep breath. She wasn't sure what would happen next, but something inside her had shifted. She wasn't the scared little girl who had been afraid of her father's words. She wasn't going to let those words define her anymore. She was ready to start finding her own voice. Back inside the bus, the atmosphere had changed. The passengers who had been watching the scene unfold now went back to their own business. But there was a quiet understanding among them, a sense that something had just happened, something important. They might not have spoken up, but they had witnessed what real strength looked like. Not the loud, angry kind, but the quiet kind that came from standing up for someone who couldn't stand up for themselves. As Jake sat back down, he glanced out the window. He had always believed in doing the right thing, even if it meant stepping out of his comfort zone. He didn't regret what he'd done, but he knew that change wasn't easy. Emma had a long road ahead of her, and so did her father. Jake couldn't solve all their problems in one day, but maybe he had given Emma a small piece of hope. And sometimes, that's all someone needs. The bus began to move again, the tires crunching over the pavement as it continued down the road. Jake sat quietly, his hands resting in his lap, and let the rhythm of the ride calm his thoughts. He had made a difference today, but it was up to Emma to decide what to do next. He hoped she would remember his words, and more importantly, he hoped she would remember that she deserved to be treated with kindness and respect. For Emma, the journey had just begun, and maybe, just maybe, the hardest part was over. The cool breeze brushed across Emma's face as she walked home from the bus stop. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows on the sidewalk. Her heart was still racing, but there was a small, quiet part of her that felt at peace. She had stood up to her father without saying a word. Jake had done the talking for her, and it had made all the difference. As she walked up the steps to her house, Emma felt a mix of nervousness and strength. She wasn't sure what kind of reaction she would get from her father. Would he still be angry? Would he apologize? She didn't know, but she was ready for whatever came next. She had learned something important today. She didn't have to let his words control her. When Emma opened the door, the familiar smell of dinner cooking filled the air. It was the same old smell, the one that had comforted her for years. But today, it felt different. Today, it felt like she was walking into a new chapter in her life. Her father was sitting at the kitchen table, his eyes focused on the newspaper. He didn't look up when she walked in. And for a moment, Emma wondered if he had already forgotten about the bus ride. But then she saw it. The tightness in his shoulders, the way he was gripping the paper with both hands. He was angry, still. Emma took a deep breath and walked over to the table, standing in front of him. For a moment, she just looked at him, trying to decide what to say. There was so much she wanted to tell him, but the words didn't come easily. She wanted him to understand. She wanted him to know that his words had hurt her for so long, and that they still did. Greg didn't look up at her. He just muttered, "You're late." Emma felt the familiar sting of his words, but this time, it didn't hurt as much. "I was on the bus," she said quietly. He glanced up at her, his expression hard. "And what, you couldn't hurry up? You've always been slow." Emma felt the anger rising in her chest. She wanted to yell at him, to tell him how much his words had affected her. But instead, she took a deep breath and decided to try something different. "I'm not slow," she said, her voice steady but firm. "And I'm not lazy either." Greg raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by her response. He put the newspaper down and crossed his arms. "What's this about?" he asked, his tone harsh but curious. Emma sat down at the table across from him, her heart beating faster now. "You've always said those things to me, Dad. You've always made me feel like I'm not good enough." Greg's eyes widened, and for a moment, Emma thought he might say something to defend himself. But he didn't. Instead, he just stared at her, as if he was seeing her for the first time. "I've never meant to hurt you," he said slowly, though his voice lacked conviction. I want you to do better, Emma. I don't want you to be a failure." Emma took another deep breath, fighting back the tears that were threatening to rise. "I don't need you to tell me that," she said, her voice trembling but strong. "I know I'm not perfect, but I'm trying. I don't need to be perfect. I just need you to see me for who I am, not for who you want me to be." Greg didn't say anything at first. He just stared at her, his face unreadable. Emma could feel the tension in the room, thick and heavy. She didn't know if he would ever understand. But for the first time, she didn't feel like she had to explain herself. She had said what she needed to say. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Greg spoke. His voice was quieter this time, almost hesitant. "I didn't realize I was doing that to you." Emma blinked, surprised by his words. She hadn't expected an apology, but it felt like a step in the right direction. Maybe, just maybe, he was starting to see her. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice soft but sincere. "I didn't mean to make you feel that way." Emma nodded, still unsure of how to react. She had always wanted to hear those words from him, but now that she had, it felt different. She wasn't sure if things would change overnight, but she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't the same person she was before. As they sat in silence, Emma felt a weight lift from her shoulders. Maybe their relationship wouldn't be perfect. Maybe it would take time to rebuild the trust that had been broken. But for the first time in years, Emma felt like there was hope. She stood up from the table, her heart a little lighter than it had been before. "I'm going to my room," she said quietly. Greg didn't say anything, but Emma could feel his gaze on her as she left the room. She didn't need to hear more. She just needed to know that things could get better. As she closed the door behind her, Emma allowed herself a small, hopeful smile. The next few days passed slowly for Emma. Things at home had been quieter than usual, and for once, the tension between her and her father wasn't as strong. But even though Greg had apologized, Emma knew that change wouldn't happen overnight. She wasn't sure what to expect, but she felt like something had shifted, even if it was just a little. She was still cautious around her father, unsure of how much she could trust him, but she had taken the first step, and that was enough for now. Emma found herself spending more time in her room. It was her safe space, the one place where she didn't have to worry about harsh words or judgment. She didn't want to talk to anyone about what had happened on the bus or the conversation with her father. It felt too personal, too raw. But something inside her told her that she wasn't alone. She wasn't the only one who had been hurt by someone they loved. At school, Emma felt a little different. She wasn't as afraid of speaking up anymore. Her classmates noticed the change. She didn't shrink into the background like she used to. She raised her hand in class when she had an answer, and she found herself smiling more, even when she didn't have a reason to. Her confidence had started to grow, bit by bit. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. One afternoon, Emma was walking home from school when she saw a familiar face standing on the corner. It was Jake, the man who had stood up for her on the bus. He was standing near the same bus stop where she had gotten off that morning. His dark eyes met hers, and he gave her a friendly nod. Emma hesitated for a moment, but then walked over to him. "Hey," she said, a little unsure of what to say. Jake smiled, a warm, genuine smile. "Hey, Emma, how's everything going?" His voice was calm, as if he really cared about how she was doing. Emma shrugged but smiled back. It's okay, I guess. It's different. She paused, thinking about the way things had been at home. My dad's been quieter. He apologized, but I'm not sure if things will really change. Jake nodded, as if he understood. It takes time. Sometimes people need to realize what they've done before they can change. And sometimes it's up to you to decide what kind of relationship you want to have with them. Emma looked at Jake, his words sinking in. She had never thought about it that way. All these years, she had felt like she had no choice in how things were with her father. But maybe that wasn't true. Maybe she had a say in how things could go from here. I've been thinking about that, Emma admitted. I've been scared of my dad for so long. And now, I'm not sure how to handle it. I'm not sure what to do. Jake nodded thoughtfully. It's okay to be scared, but you're stronger than you think. And sometimes, you don't have to have all the answers right away. Just take things one step at a time. Emma smiled a little, feeling a weight lift off her shoulders. Talking to Jake, hearing his calm words, helped her realize something important. She didn't have to fix everything right away. She didn't have to carry the burden of change by herself. It could happen slowly, at its own pace. Thanks, Jake, Emma said softly. I don't think I'd be able to do any of this without someone telling me I can. It means a lot. Jake gave her a reassuring smile. You've got this, Emma. You don't need to be perfect. Just be you, and take care of yourself first. Everything else will fall into place. Emma nodded, feeling more at peace than she had in a long time. As they said their goodbyes, she felt a sense of calm wash over her. She didn't have to have everything figured out today or tomorrow. She could take it one step at a time, just like Jake said. As Emma continued her walk home, she felt the warmth of the sun on her face. She had taken a step forward, and that was something. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she knew she could face it. For the first time in a long time, she believed that things could get better. The weeks passed, and things at home slowly started to change. Emma had learned that healing, like change, didn't happen in a day. Her father, Greg, was quieter than before, but that didn't mean everything was perfect. He was still trying to figure out how to be a better parent. Emma could see the effort he was making, even if it was small. For the first time, she could tell he was trying to listen more and speak less, and that was a good start. Emma didn't expect things to be perfect right away. But with each passing day, she began to feel more confident. She was standing up for herself in ways she never had before. Whether it was telling her classmates she didn't like being treated a certain way, or speaking her mind at home, she was growing stronger. It felt like a new chapter in her life was beginning. One evening, as Emma was sitting at the dinner table, Greg surprised her. He put down his fork, cleared his throat, and looked at her. Emma, he said softly, his voice a little hesitant. I've been thinking about the things I said to you. I've been thinking about how I treated you. I know I haven't always been the father I should have been. Emma looked at him, unsure of what to say. She had heard him say something like this before, but there was something different in his tone this time. It was quieter, more genuine. I'm sorry, he continued, looking down at his plate. I've said things I shouldn't have said, and I've been harder on you than I should have been. I know I've made you feel bad about yourself, and I regret that. Emma felt a knot in her stomach. She had been waiting for this moment, but hearing him say it out loud was still a little overwhelming. I don't know what to say, she whispered. It's hard for me to believe you sometimes. You've hurt me a lot. Greg nodded, his eyes filled with regret. I know, and I don't expect you to forget all the things I've said or done. But I want to try. I want to be a better father. I want you to feel safe and loved, not afraid of me. Emma took a deep breath. She didn't know if she could completely forgive him yet, but she appreciated that he was trying. He was showing that he wanted to change, and that meant something to her. Maybe it wouldn't happen overnight, but that didn't mean it couldn't happen. "I'm not sure how to trust you again," Emma admitted. "But I want to try too. I want to believe that things can be better." Greg's face softened, and he nodded. "I understand. It'll take time. But I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." Emma felt her heart swell a little. She wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like there was hope. She didn't have to carry the weight of the past anymore. The road to healing wasn't easy, but she wasn't walking it alone. The next few days were quiet, but there was a sense of calm in the house that hadn't been there before. Emma continued to focus on herself. She spent more time with her friends, started reading more, and even joined a club at school. She felt like she was finally finding her place in the world. The quiet moments at home were still filled with uncertainty, but they were no longer filled with fear. One afternoon, Emma ran into Jake again. He was standing near the park, leaning against a fence. When he saw her, he waved. "Hey, Emma," he called out. She smiled and walked over to him. "Hi, Jake. How's everything going?" Jake gave a small shrug. "Same as usual. But how about you? How are things at home?" Emma hesitated for a moment before answering. It's better. I don't know if everything's fixed yet, but I feel like we're starting over. My dad's trying, and that's all I can ask for right now." Jake smiled at her. "That's good to hear. You've got a lot of strength in you, Emma. Don't forget that." Emma nodded, feeling the sense of gratitude. "Thanks for everything. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't stepped in that day." Jake shrugged, looking a little embarrassed. "I'm just glad I could help." As they said their goodbyes, Emma couldn't help but feel thankful. She had come a long way since the day on the bus. She was stronger now, more confident, and ready to face whatever came next. Her journey wasn't over, but it had already begun to shape her into someone new, someone who knew her worth, someone who knew she deserved respect. As Emma walked home that day, she felt the warmth of the sun on her face. It was a small, simple moment, but it was one she would never take for granted. She was finally learning how to live for herself, and that, more than anything, was a new beginning.